This meeting is being held to review and revise SOP 130. It is the sole item on the agenda. To be clear, this is not a trial or adversarial hearing. Chief Morales has already indicated that MPD is not targeting immigrants, nor is MPD interested in becoming an extension of federal agencies responsible for enforcing immigration laws. Nonetheless, the public has expressed confusion and significant fear in connection with this matter. Therefore, the purpose of this meeting is to hear proposed changes from all stakeholders with the goal of making clear to both the public and MPD what is to be expected and not expected of officers when dealing with foreign nationals. We are doing so in committee to allow for maximum public input and transparency in order to not only build community trust in and encourage cooperation with MPD, but also so that we settle on an SOP that does not expose MPD to the loss of federal grants. I am confident that through this process, we can come to a final product that all affected parties can live with. To that end, we will start with MPD discussing its proposed revisions, and then we will move on to public comment. While we may not adhere to a strict 2-minute rule for public comment, we ask that members of the public be specific and reasonably concise. We anticipate that many people will want to weigh in and ask that you be respectful of your fellow citizens who have yet to speak. The members of this committee may ask questions throughout the meeting, and we may ask you to wrap up your thoughts when necessary. Chief?
So first and foremost, I don't know if it's appropriate, I believe it is, to request a moment of silence for Sandra Parks and her family who are mourning the loss of their precious 13-year-old daughter who was killed yesterday in an act of senseless gun violence.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the commissioners for having this public hearing tonight. Chief Morales wanted me to convey that any time the public is able to give comments on or about their police department, it strengthens the trust between the community and the officers that serve. So, on behalf of Chief Morales, I wanted to send his regrets for not being able to attend tonight's hearing. He did hold a town hall meeting 8 days ago with the Southside community regarding MPD's policy on immigration, knowing his scheduling conflicts for tonight. He looks forward to holding similar town hall meetings soon. So as far as the SOP on foreign nationals, diplomatic immunity, and immigration enforcement, I believe it is SOP 130. It's my understanding that this SOP was drafted and has been in effect since July 14th, 2017, and that this SOP was approved by the City Attorney's Office. So I think Chief Morales had said at the community meeting that in no way does MPD go out and knock on doors looking for immigration violations, things of that nature. Is just does not happen. I've spent over 25 years in law enforcement here in the city of Milwaukee, and not once have I investigated any type of illegal immigration status of the citizens of Milwaukee. It just doesn't happen. There are certain times where officers may contact ICE or they may not. It's their discretion according to our SOP, and that is arrested for a felony. So if a person does an armed robbery or a carjacking, that is a felony, and obviously those in those instances we may contact. If they're arrested for a misdemeanor involving possession of a use of a dangerous weapon, if they're arrested for a terrorism-related offense or is otherwise reasonably suspected of involvement in terrorism, is arrested for any offense involving the entry of or fraudulent assimilation of undocumented foreigners into the country, or is reasonably suspected of participating in the organized venture to bring or fraudulently assimilate undocumented foreigners into the country, is a previously deported felon, or is reasonably suspected of participating in violent criminal street gang activity. So those are the times where officers may contact ICE. But again, even those instances, I personally and none of the detectives that I have ever supervised have contacted immigration. Normally, they are concentrating on the victim and closing out that case. Person is then transferred to the sheriff's department, and then the sheriff's department follows their procedures. So that's it in a nutshell. I don't know if you have any questions I can answer.
You did submit some revisions that you are suggesting for subsection 130.25. Did you want to talk about those?
So this is the non-immigration classification, the U visas. So just as an update, it's my understanding that those U visas are issued to crime victims so that they can help in the prosecution of the criminals. And I apologize if I misstate this, but so in 2017 I have updated request totals. So in 2017 there were 281 total requests for U visas. There is one pending from 2017 that requires some investigative follow-up. In 2018 there were 174 year to date. There's 59 pending. So I know that we recently transferred the people responsible for U visas from our forensic division to our OMAP division. We think that under that division they'll be able to better take the backlog and work them more quickly. There's a little bit more staff there that can help out. I know they've been through some training recently, so we're hoping to take this backlog and eliminate it.
So could you just walk me through, how many people do you have? Is it like one person, a team of folks that are receiving the requests and reviewing them?
Yeah, so before it, it's with anything in the police department, while there may be one person assigned to, that's their normal day-to-day job, when there's a backlog in certain areas, they may take, and it's really up to, in this case now, Director Howard, to take people that are doing other jobs to help in that area. So while we may have one person assigned, if the backlog becomes too great, then really it's up to Director Howard to understand that backlog and move people to help in that area.
Okay, so what is considered a too great backlog?
Well, I guess that would be up to Director Howard.
Because you have received, where in November of 2018, you received a total of 174, and you still have 59 pending. So how many people are currently working to close out those 59 that are pending?
So the recent transfer, we transferred an officer to that area to help. I'd have to get back to find out exactly how many people are working on it.
Right, because I know that part of the revisions that were submitted include a 120-day processing deadline. So I'm asking how many people you have working to do that, to maintain that sort of deadline. Is that realistic, considering you only had 174 for the year and you still have 59 pending?
Yeah, I don't know, and I don't know when these came in, so they could have very well came in all in September,
Right.
October, or even this month. So that number may be a little deceiving. So I'll get back to this. I mean, I know that, again, it's hard to say, okay, we've got 10 people working. I know we don't have 10 people. I know that there is an officer that is her full-time job. Whether or not Director Howard now takes more personnel when there becomes a backlog or when certain U visa requests are starting to bump up against that deadline, if she reallocates resources to address those U visas so that they fall within that deadline, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So it really is, it's just going to depend.
Okay, just one quick intermission. We do have Hmong and Spanish translators available. Individuals can get headsets in the rear left corner of the room if you are interested in receiving translation services. I don't know how to say that in Hmong, but I can say it in Spanish. Tenemos intérpretes disponibles hoy si necesitan. Hay audífonos en la esquina de la izquierda. I do have some more questions about that because I also noticed that, so 120 days sounds reasonable. I don't know if you have any sort of priority for folks that are currently in detention or in, removal proceedings, or whose children are derivatives who may be aging out. Is there any distinction as to how you are handling those types of requests that are a little bit more time limited?
Quite honestly, I'm not sure. I apologize. I don't know whether they take those considerations and move those towards the front. I don't know.
Okay. I also had a question about, it indicates that decisions are final and that there is no appeal. I personally have submitted various requests for U certification, and sometimes they were denied improperly, and so I had to submit a second request explaining the reasons why that was not permissible, and then they eventually were granted. But if you're telling folks that this decision is final and that there is no appeal, if they aren't actually being represented by an attorney, they would probably just walk away and assume that they can't proceed with their applications. Is there an alternative that you might be considering in order to maybe, instead of a flat-out denial, send out an intent to deny and the reasons why so that folks can address it?
Yeah.
Good evening, Madam Chair, Commissioner. With the retirement of Inspector Tom Stigler, who was the last inspector of the Criminal Investigation Bureau, the final checking of the certification forms was passed to me a few months ago. So I've been doing it for, I should say, several months now. And I have not come across one that was not sent to us by a law firm. So I would say it, at least the one in my experience, they're always sent to us by an advocate for the person who is applying. And I don't know if the process has gotten better, or if I just, or if we just haven't had the situation that you describe. But the sergeant that is working on these certifications, it's very rare for her to recommend that we not certify one of these. I'll be sure to doubly check those because they come with a memo and with an explanation. And generally, it's just flat out, it's not a qualifying offense, or they're not a victim, somebody else is. I haven't seen. I have seen one recently where a person was involved in some gang activity, but it's very rare, at least since I've been doing this, that we deny any of these. That we,
Okay.
I shouldn't say deny,
But
because
you
we don't approve or deny. We just verify the
Well, a
certification.
certification, yeah, well, but they are approved or denied through the department. You said you just were taking up this since when?
I can't remember when Inspector Stigler retired. It was around the time that Chief Flynn retired.
Okay.
maybe a month or so later. So,
Okay.
and then there probably was a backlog, and then in the late spring or early summer, they started arriving in my in basket. So I started handling the certifications.
Okay. So it may be true that not many requests come from individuals who are not represented, but I do think it would be best practice to make it so that if a person is not represented, they can actually proceed on their own. Because in immigration proceedings, folks are not entitled to legal representation. I mean, well, they are, but they would have to hire them on their own, and not everybody is capable of doing that. So I would like to make it so that a person who is not represented by legal counsel is still able to make the request and seek some type of legal remedy in the immigration side of things. Because this particular benefit, if without the certification, you can't move forward. So it should be made as user-friendly as possible, I think. So did you get any sort of special training in this area?
I read the federal guidelines.
Okay.
I've been doing this job a long time, very familiar with the law, and the guideline, in my opinion, the guidelines are very simple. I don't take it upon myself to approve or deny.
The guidelines, when you say that, what are you referring to?
The guidelines for the certification, the I-1918, the form
918B,
itself, the guideline for that form, the guidelines for us for that form itself are very simple. The person's a victim of a qualifying crime, or cooperated with law enforcement, and I don't take it upon myself to do anything other than that.
Okay.
So like I said, we certify the vast majority of those. It's very rare that I get a memo saying that this person or this incident does not meet the guidelines. I can't speak to what it was like before, but right now it's unusual for me to get those.
Well, I asked you about the training because the comment you made where somebody was not, you said they were not the victim, they were
Or a qualifying crime
related
or...
to the victim or near the victim, and those individuals actually, under the definition of victim, would actually qualify still. They don't have to be the direct victim.
No, I understand
So
that.
I just asked you because of that.
No, I understand that. But there are people who apply who simply do not meet the criteria. That's what I'm
Okay.
talking about.
And then the individuals, it goes directly to you, or does
No.
it go to somebody else and they
By the time-
put a packet together and
Yes.
move it up the chain?
By the time I get it, it's done. The form's filled out. The packet contains the police reports that reference the crime that the applicant was the victim of, and the summary that describes their victim status or involvement. It'll say very briefly what happened, if there were any injuries, and if the person cooperated or not.
Okay. Did you have any questions?
You said qualified crimes, right? I noticed a change on the SOP to the highlights that were other violent crimes. Why is that change being made?
I can't answer for what the changes are made to the SOP. I didn't work on the SOP. I use the federal guidelines, and there's a list in the of crimes and.
Right. Well, not every crime that's a qualified criminal activity actually involves an element of violence, so that
Yes.
probably should not be
Be there.
included.
Yeah, there are crimes that are substantially similar, and. But again, it's rare that one of these doesn't meet the criteria.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll move to the public comment portion. Our first public comment is from Jens Marti. Right, Marty?
Hi, Commissioners. Jans Marti. I was reading through the SOP. One of the things that struck me was in section 130.30, the first paragraph under policy. There are some elements of language in there that I know that the second paragraph does mention basing the policy on data-driven decisions. However, the last part of the first sentence of that first paragraph mentions reducing the levels of crime, fear, and disorder in the city of Milwaukee. While I can see that based on data you can determine the levels of crime, how do you determine the levels of fear and disorder? I think those are a little bit excessive parts of language.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the section that you cited?
130.30,
130.30, okay.
First
first
paragraph.
paragraph.
So I think there are some sections that probably the language is a little bit excessive. It doesn't really mean anything based on data. And I would be curious to understand, seeing that this has been in position for a year, what kind of data is there that immigrants have any effect, or illegal immigrants or immigrants themselves have any effect on the levels of crime? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Assistant Chief, did you have any?
Well, that is a good question, and so if I can just maybe clarify, he's looking for data on whether or not immigrants or illegal immigrants have any reduction in crime or fear. That we don't keep any of that data. We don't ask anybody their immigration status to even go down the route of collecting it. So we don't, I guess there would be no way for us to answer the question, because we don't keep track of that data on immigrants, does that make sense?
Just to be clear, you're saying that you never inquire as to an individual's immigration status?
I cannot think of any time that we would ask a person their immigrant status. Now, the SOP says that we can under certain instances, but again, it's my experience that we never ask that question.
So hypothetically speaking, if you came across an individual that is being arrested for a felony where an officer has the discretion to inquire as to the person's immigration status, and they did in fact ask that question, where would that be recorded?
I guess it would be recorded in some type of report, but again, I've never seen it in any reports. Just haven't.
Okay. Our next public comment is, can you read this?
Is it Eugenia Figueroa? Okay.
Yes. How do you pronounce your last name?
Afina Gueno.
Nina Geno.
Thank you very much for hosting this meeting. Same subsection, but Part B.
Which
at the end of
section,
the
I'm sorry?
page. So it is 130.30
Okay, B.
B. I understood from the text here and what was said here as well that police officers don't routinely inquire into an individual's immigration status. However, the rest of this paragraph contradicts this, saying that that does not preclude the department from cooperating with federal immigration officials when requested, or from notifying these officials in serious situations where a potential threat to the public is perceived. I wonder if that would be enforceable in any way, or whether it would make sense to just get rid of this part because it contradicts the previous one, or whether there is a list of this, more specific list of these situations. And I would just suggest to make it a policy of not inquiring into a person's immigration status, and that's it, deleting the rest of this.
Thank you. Right. I do think there are some portions that sort of are inconsistent because it says, we don't do this, but. So maybe, you know, there's some language that needs to be a little bit more clarified so that it's clear to the public and officers when it should be asked, if it can be asked, et cetera, because it does read, when you just read through it, that for the most part, you're saying we do not involve ourselves with federal immigration enforcement, but then you do say sometimes we do. So that's where the part, it causes the confusion. So I think maybe we can get some better language inserted in those sections. Our next comment is from Emilio de Torre.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking you for holding this much more public-facing event this year to take a look at SOP 130. I'd like to acknowledge Chief Morales' more public-facing commitment to support the immigrant community here in Milwaukee. I'd also hope that some of the language can be tightened, especially around 130.30B, the paragraph that was just brought up. So that there's clarity. I know that there is probably some federal guidelines for determining when local law enforcement has to operate in conjunction with federal immigration officials. So if that could be clarified, maybe it's after the first sentence says this prohibition does not preclude the department from cooperating with federal immigration officials when requested, and then perhaps something along the lines of and accompanied by evidence of a serious crime, or something which clarifies specifically the deadly nature of the encounter. And then I had not yet read the amendments from the Milwaukee Police Department pertaining to section 130.25, the suggested revisions. And thank you for addressing them. My only concern there is in regards to the backlog, and that I believe starting 2017 there was a congressionally mandated cap of only 10,000 people in the United States could receive a U visa. So if their year, which I understand begins October, for this U visa issuance is capped at 10,000, and we have almost 200 in the city, the 34th largest city in the United States. Other cities may max out on their U visa issuance federally and not provide that opportunity to witnesses of crimes here in Milwaukee. Those are my two concerns. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next public comment is from Paul Mozina.
Hello. Hello. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I was just wondering, just as a matter of process, if the changes, if the changes that are being suggested could be made public. I mean, I don't see the proposed changes on the website. Go ahead, Executive Director.
There have not been any specific changes recommended yet, would be my understanding. And Commissioner Cabrera can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking from this meeting that this committee would come up with proposed recommendations, and that would be formulated in a report that would be public. And that committee report would then have to go to the full commission for consideration. and voting on in terms of approval or not. So we are, I think, at the beginning stage of trying to figure out where there may be room for changes or what potential changes could be made, and then developing more specifics about what specific changes this committee may recommend to the full board in terms of adoption.
That makes, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, go
Well,
ahead.
the Milwaukee Police Department did submit
Right.
suggested revisions that are solely related to the U non-immigrant classification.
Right, so there's a couple different paths here. One path could be that this committee could decide to make a decision solely on the revisions requested by MPD, which relate only to 130.25, and then separate and apart from that, come up with recommendations for other parts of the SOP that the MPD did not recommend, or they could do it all at once. There is currently a request before this commission as it relates to 130.25 to make amendments to that as it relates to the U visas. And at some point, the full board will have to decide specifically on that one issue, separate and apart from any other recommendations to make other changes to other sections of the SOP, because MPD has not asked for any other changes at this time, but the board can make those recommendations to the police department on its own.
Thank you. Can I ask another question, just to follow up then?
Sure.
So it would have been valuable to me as a participant to have been able to see what, at this first initial hearing, what did the police department suggest? I know that you're gonna work on it, and it's gonna be.
It's posted. The changes that they asked for 130.25 were posted publicly.
Where are they posted?
The meeting notices site
Meeting notices site.
for the
Oh,
FPC, for the
Yep.
Fire and Police Commission.
I just checked it on my smartphone. There's an agenda that has this item on it, but there's no.
Unless the link somehow
link is mine.
disappeared, but it was
Okay,
posted.
I just checked it
and
2 seconds ago,
And we'll
so I-
double check that and make sure that if it's not, it would be up, but it was
Okay.
put up, because there's no secret there in terms of the
Oh,
changes to
okay. Well, this
130.25.
just must be me then. But so then one other thing. One of the gentlemen brought up some changes for 130.30 or suggestions in that area, and you mentioned that wasn't part of, the police didn't suggest that. So your procedure then for handling suggestions from the public is that, can you just re-explain again what happens if people throw some stuff out there from the public during one of these meetings?
I'm taking notes on the different sections that are being referenced, and I'm sure the commissioners are as well. And then the members of this committee will take that information and then decide based on that what they feel in terms of proper recommendations would be. And then we have to formalize that in the form of a committee report, which would be public. That committee report detailing those specific recommendations for other changes besides the ones the police department has asked for would then be referred to the full commission at one of its regular meetings for consideration by the entire commission. And then it would be discussed publicly and potentially voted on at that meeting, or it could be held over for further consideration at another meeting.
Would you bring the police back then to negotiate it? If you thought changes were worthy for 130.30, would there be another round of discussions like this where the police were at the table and the public could have a chance to have feedback, or is it kind of
Right,
like?
so this is our first committee meeting on this particular subject matter. Today, we're more on the page of hearing thoughts and suggestions from all stakeholders. Then we would review that and possibly try to reconcile it with the different points of view. Yes, there probably will be another meeting where we would present a sort of draft of what language has been incorporated or not incorporated, and then we would hear more feedback. But we do want to make sure we hear from the public, but we also have to keep in consideration that MPD is constrained by certain federal laws that we can't ignore. So that's where we would have to work into somehow finding a satisfactory compromise.
Thank you. Go
And
ahead,
just
sir.
to your point, you just need to click on the link on the item, and it will pull out all
so
the
you pulled it
pages.
up.
So I was able to do it on myself.
Okay.
Yeah.
The dates?
Yeah,
Wait a second. So are you saying that if I open up the agenda, there are
You open the
links-
agenda
and
and
there's
then
links in the
click
agenda?
on the actual item, and then all the
Thank you.
PDF will
Sorry.
download. You have enough data on your phone, and you'll be able to see it.
Okay.
129 pages.
Thanks a lot. I didn't
I know we put it up.
I didn't drill in far enough. I appreciate your taking the time to answer my questions.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.
You're welcome.
Our next public comment is from Christine Newman Ortiz.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My recommendation would be that, as was expressed back in June, that, we have a process that can provide, more opportunity for more kind of thoughtful input and discussion with Fire and Police Commission, obviously the Milwaukee Police Department, and key constituency groups that represent communities that are directly impacted by police interaction as it relates to immigrants or refugees or people who are perceived to be immigrants or refugees. And so I thank you for this initiative in terms of trying, to bring back a subject that had been requested back in June. I want to just flag, but I would say that the process kind of did take a number of people by surprise. So I think just moving forward, I appreciate that my understanding now that this is kind of like one step in that process. I just want to share some of the suggestions that were brought back in June that we had made around the kind of revised recommendations we'd like to see with the standard operating procedure. We do think that there needs to be a higher standard, that Milwaukee deserves a higher standard and should exemplify the best policies in place in the nation, not just in the state. We are a majority people of color city. We have a thriving, diverse immigrant and refugee community. And especially in a climate now where there's so much of aggressive political rhetoric and literally people being stripped of their rights. And at the end of September, we also had the largest raid that I've seen experienced in the 20 years that I've been doing immigrant rights organizing here in Wisconsin, statewide. So this increase in hate crimes, we need to have higher standards. And I think for me, the golden rule of the higher standard is that when we talk about collaboration, the sharing of information or holding or detaining anyone for immigration, the golden rule is that you only do that if it's accompanied by a judicial warrant. Otherwise, you are violating the Constitution, you are violating people's constitutional rights. That's for everybody, regardless of immigration status. And so unless that is really the standard that we should have, and why? Because obviously that, number one, it respects people's due process rights. So after they have served their sentence or after they've been found innocent of whatever charge and released, that they have served their sentence and should not be held beyond that. Obviously, that's a public safety issue for that. Right now, there's tremendous fear. In this last raid, ICE pretended to be police in many instances statewide, and that has a very detrimental effect on building trust with local law enforcement. And we need that. We know we need community police, good, strong relations to address crime and reducing that. So that would be my biggest takeaway here, the biggest recommendation. The only other piece that is in specific language under Section F, page 8 of 9, it references subversive activities as something that would be a basis for police officers at their discretion to hand over to immigration. That's just, when I see language like that, I find it very disturbing. It's that kind of language that was used by COINTELPRO back in the 70s to go after civil rights activists, and it's just has no place in any kind of standard operating procedure. So those would be the key takeaways: a working body, a higher standard to protect constitutional rights, and that of no information sharing or handing over unless accompanied by judicial warrant, and removing that language.
Commissioner, if I could just ask you to clarify which specific section, because when I look at my version of page 8, I don't have
Oh, it's
that
like
language on
F, number 3.
F3,
F3.
Says,
Okay, I just want to make sure I have the right.
terrorism related offense. The rest for an offense.
The subversive activities.
The last one.
So many versions in here.
Oh, okay.
The last one.
I
the
see.
last
Okay,
piece.
yep, on page 10 for us. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure I had the right reference in the notes. Okay.
They're probably, you're going off of the last,
was that removed?
what was last,
No, it's in there. It's
Okay.
just on a different page.
it's 9
so.
pages because they're probably using the one that doesn't include the
The revised suggested.
duties and stuff.
Got it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just want to make sure I have the right. and then
Our next public comment is from Tammy Rivera.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for this opportunity. I want to direct my comments more towards process, as my colleagues are much more astute at analyzing and been engulfed in the policy itself. And so I want to preface my request by reminding us all of how heightened the anti-immigrant sentiment has been from some sectors in our nation. And given the population that we have, specifically the population that Southside Organizing Center serves, which is the South Side, which is comprised of a 70% Latino population, and that many, not all, but many of those anti-immigrant sentiments have been directed to our Mexican and other Latino communities, that we take extra efforts and energy to communicate, to have an inclusive process, and also have a dynamic process, because what was evident in the last hiccup with the SOP change was what appeared to be a lack of informing the community, and then a lack of including the community, confusion over what was happening, a lack of communication afterwards, which heightened, I think, unnecessarily the fear in the community. And how that manifests itself for us is we're the community prosecution unit. We call it the community problem solving unit for District 2, and we extend that as a courtesy to District 6 Police Department. But we certainly, on an ongoing basis, have people call and come into our office who are not reporting crimes for fear of being perceived or discovered that they are not currently documented. And so it highly impacts our ability as community organizers to engage people in safety initiatives. And we know, because of the fear that they share with us, that they're not reporting crimes, they're under-reporting crimes, and won't even allow us at times to report it through our community prosecution unit, which can guarantee them from our part their anonymity. And so what I request is that whenever we're going to address these type of issues, that we be given some extra time, one, to be able to engage our constituencies in a process in order to come back to you with a voice from the pueblo, from the people. So requesting more time, higher levels of communication to allow us to know that these things are happening. And then, don't know how you can achieve this within your procedures, but having a dynamic process, being able to hear, oh, this is what MPD said, this is what this group says, this is what the attorney thinks is allowed, and having a more work session discussion. And I don't know if that's a subgroup, an advisory group, or you create some type of modified process here where that back and forth can go. The other thing that would be helpful in terms of increasing safety in our community is communicating and over-communicating what is our policy. And we do appreciate that our new leadership Chief Morales has taken steps to increase that, but it's needed all the more, especially because of the raids that took place. Our residents don't distinguish a police officer from a sheriff, from an ICE in many instances, and then we heard earlier that people are representing themselves differently. And although it's not specifically, the SOP, whatever added processes we can include to communicate to the community, this is what the policy is, and over communicate that to reestablish a sense of consistency. And then the impact that the lack of all of that has, like I said earlier, on the not reporting crimes, but also just people's ability to drive and then want to pull over if they, if a police pulls them over, reporting domestic violence, taking their kids to school, and engaging them in regular, community work is inhibited. So encouraging you, and then encouraging us to integrate these processes with other processes that are happening in the community, like what's happening in community organizing, what's happening at the shelters, what's happening at the city level and the county level, and even the state now that we have changes. So to me, it's a note on let's do some work around process, inclusion, and then the dynamic resolution of problem solving.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next public comment is from Daryl Morin.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Chairwoman, well, actually, can I pass some of these around, written form of my statement? So, Chairwoman Cabrera, distinguished members of this commission, Executive Director Butler, and representatives of the Milwaukee Police Department and Fire Department, and most importantly, to the great citizens and residents of Milwaukee, I'd like to thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak here before you today. I wish to thank all of you once again for raising this very serious subject for discussion and debate. Let me just go ahead and add, in addition to my statements, that I support the statements of some of our other colleagues here, as I look forward to having an opportunity to actually sit down and meet with them to discuss and generate a consensus around these policies. A little over a year ago, we were gathered here to discuss some very serious and negative, the very serious and negative impact of changes that were made by the previous administration at the Milwaukee Police Department. There were inaccurate claims and changes made to the standard operating procedure that we argued against. Ultimately, our arguments were upheld by the people of Milwaukee, the federal courts across the country, and thankfully by all of you here on the commission as it was returned to its original form. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Daryl Modine, and I do want to state this too, just due to the limited time I had to prepare. I'll be speaking on behalf of myself as the past LULAC, League of United Latin American Citizens National VP for the Midwest, as well as our council here in LULAC Council number 340, and we are submitting my statements before our state body for their approval as well. Anyways, we remain committed to working with you, the fine men and women of the Milwaukee Police Department, who are upholding their sworn oaths to provide equal protection under the law to all. We also will continue to work with federal, state, county, and local agencies and social service organizations, and most importantly, the residents of Milwaukee, to improve public safety in every neighborhood, on every street corner, and in every alley of our city. I believe we all recognize that both proactive and reactive measures will be needed if we're to be successful in making this a reality. At the heart of this issue is the trust that must exist between every member of law enforcement and the members of the communities that it served. Our one community made up of the men, women, and yes, children of our neighborhoods. And if this is to exist, it's important that every person, regardless of color, regardless of language, religion, sexual orientation, and most importantly, regardless of their place in nativity, that everyone be assured equal protection under the law, and that no one be targeted or profiled based on any suspicion of their place of origin or their immigration status. Whether it's reporting a criminal act, an act of domestic violence, a fire, or a medical emergency they are happening to be witnessing, it is critical and clearly in the public interest that each person feel comfortable in contacting their police department or their fire department without hesitation or without personal fear of penalty due to their immigration status. As such, it's important that this body ensure a policy is in place that will protect all individuals from becoming fearful of those who should be there and who they should be able to turn to in a moment of crisis, either to request protection for themselves or protection and aid for their neighbors. This policy must also discourage bad actors from acting independently to advance their own personal beliefs or political ideologies. Earlier this month, the Federal Bureau of Investigation of the U.S. Department of Justice shared their findings that there's been a 17% spike in the number of hate crimes around our country. Sadly, I'm here to say that we're seeing equally these types of events happening not only here in our city, but around the state of Wisconsin as well. Let us take this opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to protect and respect one another equally. We also encourage the adherence regarding detention guidance provided. As clearly stated in the law and as it's been upheld in the courts repeatedly, without meeting the required threshold or a court order, no individual should be detained for more than 48 hours and only as allowed under the law. I remind this body and those watching and listening this evening to this debate that an immigration detainer is not a court order. And as listed on the website of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, it is merely a request. To do so would be to detain someone beyond that period of time and outside of the bounds of state statute would be a clear violation of the law and would expose the department and, in turn, the city to tremendous liability. In closing, I wish to thank all of you for your selfless commitment to serving this distinguished commission and to thank you for exercising your independent oversight role. I look forward to working with you in the coming days and weeks to come upon and secure passage of a policy that not only protects the men, women, and children of our great city, but defends their human dignity as well. Thank you once again. God bless all of you. God bless the city of Milwaukee, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have one more public comment from Paul Vang.
Hi, good evening. My name is Paul Vang. I'm speaking on behalf of the Hmong American Women's Association. So typically when we think of immigration, oftentimes we think of the Hispanic population. But I wanted to present the concerns that my community has, the Hmong community, as well as the Southeast Asian community as a whole. So I work in civic engagement, and in late September, a coworker and I were canvassing in the neighborhood of 35th and Galena, and we encountered what looked like an unidentified law enforcement vehicle, and we suspected it was an ICE vehicle just by the way they approached us. They didn't identify who they were. But after that weekend, we found out that ICE had been in Milwaukee, and that after that, there was, I think, I believe, 3 people in Milwaukee who were detained by ICE. And so what we found was that it made it difficult for us to do our work, which was to contact our voters and to talk to our people, because they were afraid of answering their doors if it was an ICE agent at the door as well. So along with that, we saw that in Madison, there was a Hmong man who was detained by ICE. He was a felony of 2 decades ago, so he'd served his time already, but ICE decided it was time to detain him. And we see this all throughout the Southeast Asian community with our mainly men in the community who've made mistakes in the past and they've served their time, but this is something that concerns us because families are being split up, and these are men who provide for their families. In terms of language in the standard operating procedure, I would like to reiterate what others have said in regards to 13030, particularly particularly with the point. So under 13030, I'd like to echo what others have said before about serving detainers. It is just a request, and it's not mandated by law. And I think that would go a long way in establishing trust within the community and police forces, so that there needs to be language included so that it doesn't seem as if local law enforcement is required to follow through with an ICE detainer or an ICE request. Because as of now, there is language that suggests that such as in 13030E, there's a lot of language suggesting cooperation between local law enforcement and ICE, but not a lot of language that suggests that it should be optional and that it doesn't have to be followed through with. So I would like to just echo that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So one of the things that I was thinking about as I've been hearing the comments from different community members is how do we incorporate and share the information. One thing that I would suggest is a similar pattern that was utilized when we were revising the standard operating procedure for transgender, gender nonconforming individuals, and that was that various different community leaders that were LGBT, either executive directors of various different organizations or transgender folks, on their own time researched different operating procedures from different places across the country, and they sort of picked and selected the parts that they found collectively agreeable, and then they would submit an operating procedure model that they approved of. MPD would then provide input as to why or why not certain recommendations would be adopted or would not be, and the reasons why. And then us, the commission, would then ultimately voted on it. But it was sort of something that was easier for folks to be able to say, not just we don't find this language acceptable, but also providing language that they suggested for replacement. And that is something that would go further along and move things along also more quickly if we know, here's what we would like to see, this works elsewhere, and then MPD can say, well, we can do that, or we cannot, and here's why. And then the Fire and Police Commission will ultimately vote on the language that is adopted. But that is something that I would suggest folks from LULAC, VOCES, SOC, individual members of the community as yourself, Mr. Vang, you might want to provide that language, because that will help us move things along more quickly as opposed to just making the suggestion ad hoc here in committee. So I would just want to put that out there. If you do have language that you think would be best practice, that is something that you should submit to us, and then we can deliberate about it, and MPD can have something to provide input on specific language.
No, I think that's a good suggestion. I mean, it's easy to nitpick things, but I think it's easier to provide a suggestion that is valid, that is proven for us to use. We empower us to be your advocates instead of just giving me, I don't like this line, I don't like this word, give me what it should be there.
Right. Obviously, as an immigration attorney, I have plenty of ideas. But it's not just me. I can't write the whole entire standard operating procedure to my liking. So it is a community effort, as well as it's important to get the Milwaukee Police Department's position as well, because they are restrained by certain federal laws, and we also don't want to expose them to losing whatever financial assistance that they depend on as well. Yes, Alderman Perez.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to speak. I wanted to thank you and Commissioner Solet for hosting this meeting this evening. I think you've heard very clearly from our community partners on process and some suggestions. So not only do I want to lend the support of our district office, one in disseminating information and being a vehicle to add some of the language that we can be inclusive in this process. I do want to take a second also just to thank the chief for being very vocal and public about his support for the immigrant community and how police officers, he doesn't want them being used for as ICE agents. I would also remind the greater community at large that we want everyone who is eligible or wants to take advantage of our municipal ID to do so. It is a identification that every department, every division of the city must accept as identification. And we want to make sure that people are aware of that, and that with time we will finally have our, the Fire and Police Commission staff will have added a bilingual investigator to reassure the community that someone is there to handle complaints and hear complaints and move them forward in an inclusive way. So I want to make sure that I get on record to lend our support from our district office. This was a very important issue to us, as you know, in the past, and when we brought people together, we were under the gun because we had to get certified by the city attorney's office. And I appreciate this being done in a very inclusive and timely manner, that we're not under the gun and we could actually do this thoroughly and inclusive.
Yes, that is also another point I would like to make. We are not trying to rush through this. We do want to make sure that we make intentional revisions and that we don't have to keep coming back and forth and saying, still not right, let's work on it some more. If we're going to revise it, we should make sure that it is, the best possible SOP that we can come up with and that everybody can be happy with.
So thank you.
So thank you.
Count on us.
If we don't have any additional public comment, I think that would conclude our meeting today. Thank you so much, everyone, for showing up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And please keep track of our website, because that's where we post our notices of our next meetings, as well as documents that will be looked at in anticipation thereof.